Yes, Keen.
ABC just broke in over their squawk box and told us that Ronald Reagan's passed.
Do we have to go to a special report?
ABC will have one soon for us.
And as soon as ABC does, we will go to that special report.
As soon as they do.
So I'm telling you right now that it's been reported by ABC News that Ronald Reagan has passed away at the age of 93. And I'll tell you a Reagan story. Did you know he was president of the Screen Actors Guild for years and would give over 200 speeches per year just to practice up, just to practice his speech-giving skills. Are we ready now, Keen?
One of the most beloved presidents of the 20th century, the man the media called the great communicator. Ronald Wilson Reagan was always popular, even as a kid growing up in Illinois, where he was known as Dutch. After college, he started polishing those famous communication skills as a radio announcer.
That is really a show.
In the 1930s, Ronald Reagan was discovered by Hollywood. He became a successful actor with roles in some 50 films. And it was in Hollywood that he met his off-screen wives. First, actress Jane Wyman, and then Hellcats of the Navy co-star Nancy Davis.
How do you know so much about the moon?
I know a lot about it. Spend all my time looking at it when you're away.
Once a Democrat, Reagan got into Republican politics in the 1960s. After serving 2 terms as California governor, he took his conservative agenda and his optimism on the road to Washington.
We're going to put America back to work again.
With George Bush at his side, Reagan defeated Jimmy Carter in an electoral landslide. Less than 3 months into his presidency, Reagan was shot, but he rebounded remarkably well. And at 70 years of age, during his administration, the nation plunged into a recession, then experienced unprecedented economic growth and deficits. A staunch anti-communist, President Reagan brought about a thaw in the Cold War, and his policies contributed to the fall of the Soviet Union.
Mr. Gorbachev, tear down this wall.
The president's popularity suffered as a result of the Iran-Contra scandal, but only temporarily. After 8 years in the White House, Reagan passed the Republican torch to his vice president, George Bush. Before he left Washington, Mr. Reagan summed up his tenure.
We did it. We weren't just marking time. We made a difference. All in all, not bad. Not bad at all.
Ronald Reagan wasn't heard from much after being diagnosed with Alzheimer's.
This is WTAM 1100. You're listening to Sam Donaldson giving some facts and dates in the life of Ronald Reagan. We'll have live anchored coverage coming up momentarily. Ronald Reagan passed away at the age of 93. That's just coming down. We now go to live anchored coverage from ABC.
This is live coverage from ABC News. I'm Gil Gross in Los Angeles. President Ronald Wilson Reagan has died in Los Angeles at his home in the neighborhood of Bel Air at the age of 93. The former president's physical condition, of course, has been deteriorating now for 10 years since he told the world that he had Alzheimer's disease. He lasted an amazing time, longer than many friends and associates thought he would, considering the nature of the disease, and passed away today. Apparently, we are told, after coming down with pneumonia in the last few days. Mr. Reagan's wife was at his side, along with his 2 children by Nancy Reagan, Patty Davis, and Ron Reagan Jr., who had cut short a trip to Hawaii to be with the president as he passed away today at home. ABC's Bill Greenwood is in Washington. Bill?
Gil, we are told that the former president's overall physical condition began to deteriorate last week. And a source tells ABC News that the former president took a significant turn for the worse last night. We are told that Mr. Reagan was suffering from pneumonia at the age of 93. That is obviously a very deadly disease. The former president was the longest-serving president in recent years, the first president in 30 years when he took office to be elected for a second term. For the past several years, he has not been seen in public. Relatives said he was confined to his home, virtually bedridden, and unable to communicate. His family said much the same thing, Gil. It's a sad irony because this is the man who was known as the great communicator, arguably the most popular American president since Dwight D. Eisenhower in the 50s. And those of us at ABC Radio had a sort of kinship for him because, as we all know, he started his career as a radio announcer, a sports announcer.
Absolutely, Bill, at WOC in Davenport, Iowa, and then, of course, going on to WHO in Des Moines. I was, ironically enough, on Warner Brothers Stage 8 yesterday, where he made his first movie. He had come out here to Los Angeles in 1937 with the Chicago Cubs for spring training. And his agent told him that he might want to take a crack at this movie thing. Went over, did an audition. Jack Warner okayed it, and did his first film where he played a radio announcer.
And he was then working for WHO in Des Moines, Iowa, where he sort of hit it big as a sports caster. And he told the station he wanted to go cover the Chicago Cubs spring training camp. He went there, but his real reason was to go to Hollywood and become a movie star, and he was. He made a number of films. His career included mostly B-grade movies, as we all know, but his big break, I guess, was a movie called Kings Row in 1942. He also played Newt Rockne, All-American, and that sort of hung on him for the rest of his life. He started as a football player at Notre Dame named George Gipp, and they called him the Gipper. And, of course, everyone called Ronald Reagan the Gipper. When he ran for office, he said, come on and win one for the Gipper.
Bill, let's take more of a look at the background and the history of if there was ever an American success story, it was the life of Ronald Reagan. Here's ABC's Bob Hart.
When he left office in January of 1989, his popularity rating was the highest of any president since Franklin Roosevelt. And Ronald Reagan, who once described himself as a New Deal Democrat, had become the standard bearer of a conservative Republican movement which triumphed in the 1980s. The man who eventually served 8 years in the White House said he never meant to go into politics.
I was raised to believe you had to pay your way for the blessings bestowed on you. I was happy with my career in the entertainment world, but I ultimately went into politics because I wanted to protect something precious.
The Midwesterner who went to Hollywood in the 30s began speaking out about his values in the 50s. The TV host for General Electric toured the country, making speeches to business audiences, and he made a name for himself among fellow conservatives. Maybe he never meant to get into politics, but he was elected to 2 terms as governor of California. And in 1980, he captured his party's presidential nomination, then went on to beat the incumbent president.
I, Ronald Reagan, do solemnly swear
that I will faithfully execute the office of President of the United States.
Mr. Reagan capitalized on the damage to Jimmy Carter's presidency caused by the Iran hostage crisis, a crisis that ended even as he took the oath of office.
Planes bearing our prisoners left Iranian airspace and are now free of Iran.
It was a euphoric beginning, interrupted just 9 weeks later when a disturbed young man shot the president.
Here at the Washington Hilton, shots rang out as President Reagan was leaving the hotel.
The president is out of surgery and is in good condition.
A single bullet had lodged just an inch from his heart. But America's oldest president recovered and resumed his efforts to establish his conservative agenda. He prodded Congress into passing tax cuts that were supposed to have a trickle-down effect, stimulating economic growth. During the Reagan era, the rich grew richer, the poor grew poorer. The ranks of the homeless grew, but inflation ebbed, and the majority of Americans felt their economic well-being was improving.
WTAM 11.
Never far from his Hollywood roots, Reagan borrowed another actor's catchphrase to show he was ready to fight for his economic beliefs.
I have my veto pen drawn and ready for any tax increase that Congress might even think of sending up. And I have only one thing to say to the tax increasers. Go ahead, make my day.
American self-esteem also seemed to improve under the get-tough approach he followed in dealing with communism.
While they preach the supremacy of the state, declare its omnipotence over individual man, and predict its eventual domination of all peoples on the earth, They are the focus of evil in the modern world.
Throughout his presidency, Ronald Reagan would be the #1 booster of the Contra rebels in Nicaragua. And when he saw what he regarded as a communist threat to the Caribbean island of Grenada, he sent in the Marines. That and the bombing raid he ordered on the capital of Libya in response to terrorism further strengthened his standing with many voters and with many allied leaders. He talked tough, too, about a domestic plague and had a simple approach to the drug problem.
What we've got to do now is make certain that we continue to give our young people, like the ones with us here today, the support and backing they need to just say no to drugs.
Other problems would surface, and they would tarnish the prestige of his presidency. Some of his closest aides had ethical conflicts, and the entire administration was hurt by the scandal over the secret arms sales to Iran, and then the diversion of profits to the Contras. The president first denied there was any arms for hostages swap with terrorists, then denied knowing what his underlings had been doing. But he'd later have to take responsibility for what happened.
The responsibility for the decision and the operation is mine, and mine alone.
His popularity would be diminished, then surge again when the Cold War hardliner became what seemed like best of friends with Soviet leader Mikhail Gorbachev. They held 4 separate summits, the last in Moscow, where Reagan endorsed the Gorbachev reforms in a speech to university students.
Your generation is living in one of the most exciting, hopeful times in Soviet history. It is a time when the first breath of freedom stirs the air, and the heart beats to the accelerated rhythm of hope.
The two leaders would agree on elimination of an entire class of nuclear weapons and make headway on another agreement to scale back long-range missiles. As his second term ended, the politicians and the pundits would argue about the kind of legacy he left behind, but Ronald Reagan was never plagued by self-doubt, and he left office riding high.
The way I see it, there were 2 great triumphs. 2 things that I'm proudest of. One is the economic recovery in which the people of America created and filled 19 million new jobs. The other is the recovery of our morale. America is respected again in the world and looked to for leadership.
In 1995, we learned the great communicator would speak to the nation no more. Ronald Reagan had Alzheimer's disease and retreated to his California home, but his devoted wife Nancy nursed him and spoke for him.
Our duty is to support one another each and every day, because for the caregiver, it's a long goodbye.
I'm Bob Hart, ABC News.
I'm Gil Gross in Los Angeles as we continue with our live anchored coverage on the death of former President Ronald Reagan of Alzheimer's disease at age 93. ABC's Jim Hickey is outside the Bel Air estate of President Reagan. Jim?
Well, Gil, activity here outside the estate has picked up significantly in the past 10 or 15 minutes. Just a few moments ago, Michael Reagan, one of the Reagan's sons, arrived here at the home, driving in through the security gate in a yellow Jeep. He had to wait for the gate to open, so reporters asked him for confirmation and comment. He said nothing at this point. There has been no direct confirmation from any of the family members inside the compound. But we do know that Mr. Reagan had taken a turn for the worse overnight, developing pneumonia. A source close to the family has told us, in addition to his Alzheimer's disease. And, of course, broadcast reports have it that Nancy Reagan said earlier today that she thought that her husband, Ronald Reagan, would die this weekend, saying that this is it. And we are waiting now to hear from the family here at the compound. Gil?
Okay, you stand by, Jim, and we will get back to you. ABC's Jim Hickey, who is outside the home of Nancy Reagan and former President Ronald Reagan, who has passed away now at age 93 after apparently a bout of pneumonia, already weakened by Alzheimer's, and of course being 93 years old, having passed away today. I should let you know that what Jim is mainly going to be able to see from where he is are the people who are coming in and out of the compound. I've gone by that home many times, living not all that far away, and you cannot actually see the house from the beginning of the driveway, but you will see the people coming in and out. ABC's Bill Greenwood is in Washington. Bill?
Gil, this has got to just be a devastating moment for Nancy Reagan. She has devoted her life to Ronald Reagan since they were married in 1952. She was an actress. She had appeared in several films with Reagan, but put her career aside. She gave it up to become a full-time wife, a loving wife, for 52 years. They had 2 children, Patty and Ron, who, as you said, are at the house now. Mrs. Reagan often putting the welfare of her husband ahead of their own children. They were just an incredible couple, and I can only guess how she is feeling at this tragic moment.
One of the, if there's been any blessing, and of course that's a hard word to use with Alzheimer's, has been how the families come back together. This was, as you said, often put their relationship ahead of the kids. It was a very splintered relationship at one time, but the family in the last 10 years has very much pulled together. Patty Davis, who at one time didn't really have much of a speaking relationship with her parents, has become very close to Nancy Reagan since her father came down with Alzheimer's disease, has been at the house almost every day, and the family really has pulled together. They met in the most interesting way. President Reagan was then head of the Screen Actors Guild, the only union president to become president of the United States. Nancy Davis, actress at that time, they were to do one film together, Hellcats of the Navy, was having a problem because she was listed in an advertisement with people she thought were more left-wing than she wanted to be associated with right after World War II. And she asked her studio head if she could have some help with this. He suggested that she meet up with the president of the Screen Actors Guild, Ronald Reagan. They had dinner together. 2 years later, they were married. And it has been quite the relationship, as you point out, ever since then.
Well, and it should also be mentioned that this was the time of communist witch hunting in the United States. President Reagan, as president of the Screen Actors Guild, took a very conservative anti-communist stance and expressed strong anti-communist views before the House Committee on Un-American Activities. So he was clearly the person that Nancy Davis, Mrs. Reagan, would have turned to at that period of time.
Bill, let me bring ABC's Pam Coulter, who's with the president in Paris, and I am told that President Bush has been told now. Any reaction there, Pam?
No reaction so far, Gil, but President Bush is expected to shortly issue a written statement on the passing of former President Reagan. The president, a spokeswoman says, though, it's likely tomorrow that Mr. Bush will make an appearance before the cameras to talk about his passing. Of course, tomorrow, Mr. Bush was scheduled to travel to Normandy, the French coast, to celebrate the 60th anniversary of the D-Day invasion. And I'm sure that event will still go on, but at some point during the day, we're expected to be hearing from the president himself about the death of Ronald Reagan. Now, the White House was informed about 10 minutes after 10 Paris time. We're 6 hours ahead of the East Coast of the United States. Apparently, former Reagan Chief of Staff Fred Ryan, one of his Chief of Staffs in California, called current White House Chief of Staff Andrew Card to pass along the news. And there was a lot of flurry here about this earlier today, because we had gotten word that the former president had taken a turn for the worst as far as his health was concerned. We had a spokesman who was close to the situation saying that the president's condition deteriorated in the past week. And then, of course, the Reagan family came forward and sort of through spokespeople said that that was not the case. And after that, the White House decided to defer any kind of comment and refer people to the spokespeople for the Reagan family. But we should be very shortly getting a written statement from President Bush.
All right, ABC's Pam Coulter in Paris. By the way, the president's father, the previous George Bush, we are told, has also been told. He, of course, was Ronald Reagan's vice president, and we're told we can expect a statement sometime later today. Very quickly, as we go back to ABC's Jim Hickey, we expect the former president's body to be taken to his presidential library and museum, which is in Simi Valley, California. He will eventually probably be buried there on the library grounds, but first at some point will be flown to Washington to lie in state at the Capitol Rotunda with a service at the National Cathedral. Yeah. ABC's Jim Hickey is outside the Reagan's home in Bel Air. Jim?
Well, Gil, people are now beginning to gather outside the home. There have been members of the media here all morning, since early morning, when word first came that President Reagan had taken a turn for the worse. Earlier this morning, his daughter, Patty Davis, who is a regular visit to the compound, arrived very early this morning, and one of the sons, Ron Reagan, cut short a vacation, and he came to the home earlier this morning. And then just a few moments ago, I saw Michael Reagan drive up in a yellow Jeep to join the family, now gathering in full force at the compound at word that the former president, has died. Gil?
ABC's Jim Hickey was outside the home in Bel Air, California. By the way, the Reagans, since 1963, have been members of Bel Air Presbyterian Church, which is right up the road from their home. And I would not be surprised if there was also, as I was mentioning, what may happen in terms of services and all the next days ahead, if there might be a private ceremony for just family and friends at Bel Air Presbyterian. 4 years ago, the president's health took a bad turn. In fact, in early October of 2000, not long before the election, and Secret Service agents were going from house to house near the church asking if they could borrow driveway space to prepare for a funeral. And that was the last time we went through this. The president bounced back at that time, but that's a sign that there may be something in the offing again for family and friends at Bel Air Presbyterian, where the president and Mrs. Reagan were in attendance for, again, more than 40 years. Before I go back to Bill Greenwood, I think it behooves us to really... This is a rare thing because we keep mentioning that farewell letter that the president wrote when he told the world of his Alzheimer's disease on November 5th, 1994. And because of that, the president really wrote his own epitaph. And let me just read a paragraph or two from that letter. He said in there, "At the moment, I feel just fine. I intend to live the remainder of the years God gives me on this earth doing the things I have always done. I will continue to share life's journey with my beloved Nancy and my family. I plan to enjoy the great outdoors and stay in touch with my friends and supporters. Unfortunately, as Alzheimer's disease progresses, the family often bears a heavy burden. I only wish there was some way I could spare Nancy from this painful experience. When the time comes, I'm confident with your help she will face it with faith and courage. In closing, let me thank you, the American people, for giving me the great honor of allowing me to serve as your president. When the Lord calls me home, whenever that day may be, I will leave with the greatest love for this country of ours and eternal optimism for its future. I now begin the journey that will lead me into the sunset of my life. I know that for America, there will always be a bright dawn ahead. Thank you, my friends. May God always bless you." And that was part of the letter in which the former President Ronald Reagan announced his Alzheimer's disease and really wrote his own epitaph when he was able to almost 10 years ago. ABC's Jim Hickey is, again, outside the family compound in Bel Air, which is part of Los Angeles, California. Jim?
Yeah, Gil, I was just listening to you recount the last time we went through this and the preparations that were made, and I wanted to let you know that the activity here outside the home in Bel Air includes one of the private security guards that watches over these very expensive homes in Bel Air. The security guard has now blocked off the street that leads to the Reagan driveway. It's now not possible to drive past the Reagan house. I'm told that within the past hour or two or three black official-looking automobiles arrived at the home. One correspondent said they appeared to her as security vehicles. So clearly the family is getting ready for this announcement and getting ready for what will be the presidential funeral. Gil?
ABC's Jim Hickey outside the Reagan home in Bel Air. It's interesting that coming into the Los Angeles Bureau today, I do something of the Reagan's travel in life in reverse, starting out near the Bel Air Presbyterian Church, which is a very impressive, large, and well-to-do church with a commanding view of the San Fernando Valley high up on Mulholland Drive. And as I approach the ABC studios, go through Studio City, and a little church called the Little Brown Church. It's open 24 hours a day. It was built on just 6 $600. It is the smallest thing, and with just a little lovely garden in front of it. That is where Ronald and Nancy Reagan were married. And it's still open 24 hours to the rich and the poor, and I still remember the pictures that you see on the wall there of Ronald and Nancy Reagan cutting the cake with Bill Holden looking over their shoulder in what is still this little neighborhood church where everything from Hollywood stars to the homeless walk in. From there to Bel Air Presbyterian is part of the really fascinating journey of the life of Ronald Reagan. Let's hear a little bit more about Ronald Reagan before he became president. Here's ABC's Stephen Tubbs.
Political observers say Reagan won the 1966 governor's race here in California, in part because his foes underestimated him. Reagan beat incumbent Edmund Brown by nearly 1 million votes and began the first of 8 years in the governor's office.
He learned the ropes. He learned how to deal with the legislature. He learned the essentials of governance.
Reagan biographer Lou Cannon.
Reagan was, on the whole, a much better governor in his second term than he was in his first.
Maybe that's because Reagan inherited a state deep in financial trouble, near bankruptcy.
I am unalterably opposed to solving this problem by increasing taxes. And I ask that you join me in rejecting this obvious and easy answer.
Governor Reagan was forced to deal with his state's racial tensions in the late 1960s. And when he ran for a second term in 1970, he tackled welfare reform. 1 in 10 Californians were on welfare at the time.
I think government has a responsibility to protect the citizenry. That's what government is all about. That's the only excuse government has for existing.
But Reagan would later write that California had become a magnet for people who wanted a handout instead of a job. Reagan's second term as governor was highlighted by tightening welfare eligibility requirements and eliminating welfare loopholes.
WTAM 1100.
Governor, but I think he was he was a very good governor, and he got better as he went along, which I think was a good augury for his presidency.
Stephen Tubbs, ABC News, Los Angeles.
I'm Gil Gross. This is live continuous coverage on the death of former President Ronald Reagan from ABC News. I'm in Los Angeles. ABC's Bill Greenwood is with us in Washington. And Bill, part of the as I said, fascinating, almost unparalleled story of Ronald Wilson Reagan is the age at which he became president of the United States. He turned 70 within about a month of taking the oath of office. And I remember at a Washington Press Club dinner, he was joking about it at one point, quoting Thomas Jefferson's advice not to worry about one's age. And then he took that pause and said, and ever since he told me that, I stopped worrying.
He liked to tell that story, Gil, and you, I'm sure, remember during the election campaign against Walter Mondale, or Jimmy Carter, I should say, when he would tell audiences who were worried about his age. He was the oldest man who ever ran for president, and he would stand there in debates with Carter and say, and I will not let my experience be a factor in my young opponent. And everybody would laugh, and he killed the age issue with his humor. He was a real man's man, and those of us who covered Ronald Reagan couldn't help but like him. I remember Sam Donaldson used to make speeches. Sam and I covered the White House with Reagan, and Sam would say, he is such a nice man that you have to like him even when he's cutting your grandmother's Social Security payments. And it was really true. He was a person who was confident in his own skin. He knew what he wanted to do with this country. He wanted to put it back on a conservative path. He was anti-communist to the core, is certainly credited with the collapse of communism in the former Soviet Union. But he was the kind of guy that liked to do male things. You remember he'd go to his ranch and he'd cut wood, and people wondered, how much wood does he really have on that ranch if he cuts it the whole time he's out there? He would eat dinner in the family quarters with TV tables, he and his wife watching television just like real people. And he liked to start the day with a joke. Donald Reagan, who was one of his White House chief of staffs, was almost under orders that when you had the first day's meeting with Ronald Reagan, you come in with a joke. And Reagan was at some pain every day to find a new joke that would make Ronald Reagan laugh.
Yes, Donald Reagan was not known for his collection of humorous anecdotes.
Indeed.
He was, as you point out, as sure of himself in the job, which was interesting because there are many people who, of course, spent a lifetime in politics, come to the presidency, and are frightened of it. I remember here in Los Angeles at the victory celebration after he won, he told supporters, Abe Lincoln, the day after his election to the presidency, gathered in his office. The newsmen had been covering the campaign and said to them, well, boys, your troubles are over now. Mine have just begun. But then he went on to say, Lincoln may have been concerned in the troubled times in which he became president, but I don't think he was afraid. Concerned but not afraid. And then he went on to say, and I am not frightened by what lies ahead. And I don't believe the American people are frightened by what lies ahead. Together we're going to do what has to be done. And there was never that sense about him that he felt overwhelmed by the job. At one point, as a matter of fact, when he was governor, were trying to get him to run for the presidency, he said he thought he was actually better suited to that job than he was to be governor.
Well, and a lot of people wondered if, in fact, that was true, Gil. I remember when Reagan was first elected, there was a big flap in Washington when Clark Clifford, who was one of the so-called wise men of Democratic politics, at a Democratic dinner, a black-tie dinner here in the Capitol, described Ronald Reagan as an amiable dunce. There was some question as to how smart he really was, and I think he got the last laugh on everybody because Reagan brought a new management style to the White House. Jimmy Carter, his predecessor, micromanaged everything. If you wanted to use the White House tennis court, you had to get a permission slip from Jimmy Carter. That has never happened as before or since. Ronald Reagan said, guys, here's what I want to do. I want to cut taxes. I want to do this and that, and you go do it and tell me how we're doing.
All right, Bill, we now have a statement. Michael Reagan, as ABC's Jim Hickey outside the Reagan's Bel Air home said, Michael Reagan drove up and went into the compound in his yellow Jeep. Said nothing at the time, but has now released a statement, and we are told there will be no further statements at this time. And Michael Reagan, President Reagan's son by his previous marriage, said this: I remember with great clarity my father's emotion when Nell Reagan, my grandmother, passed away. Until today, I did not understand the feeling of loss and pain which comes when a parent leaves you. For this reason, I will not be making public statements at this time. I pray that as America reflects on the passing of my dad, they will remember a man of integrity, conviction, and good humor that changed America and the world for the better. He would modestly say the credit goes to others. I believe the credit is his. Michael Reagan goes on to say, what I will remember is a man that changed my life. He was always there for me when I needed him. He had a way of putting everything into perspective, and I believe his determination and perseverance came from his relationship with the Lord. He played an important role in pointing me to God. I am secure in the knowledge he is with his Lord and Savior Jesus Christ in heaven. The greatest gift my father ever gave me was the simple knowledge that I would see him in heaven one day. That is from Michael Reagan, one of President Reagan's two sons. ABC's Doug Limerick has a piece on President Reagan in relation to the other presidents of these United States.
Presidential historians differ on exactly where Ronald Reagan should be ranked among the nation's presidents. But one thing's for sure, he's up there. Reagan's 2 terms were marked by economic prosperity. Remember when he laid down the gauntlet?
I have my veto pen drawn and ready for any tax increase that Congress might even think of sending up. And I have only one thing to say to the tax increasers. Go ahead, make my day.
David Broders, political columnist, he says Ronald Reagan looms large as a policymaker.
Whether you think about the escalation of the arms race with the Soviet Union, which led to the Western victory in the Cold War, or the redirection of domestic policy, the tax cuts, and the shifting of responsibilities from Washington out to the states and the local communities, he was a very large impact president.
David Broder. Of course, many people didn't care for Reagan's policies, but as historian Dr. Alan Lichtman points out, he sure did have charisma.
Ironically, I think one of the reasons that Ronald Reagan will rank fairly highly among presidents, even though most historians are liberal, is that he was a conservative with a smiling face, and you can't underestimate that. You know, we like our conservatives smiling, not snarling in America.
And Ronald Reagan, I think, will benefit from that, even in the judgment of history, and of course has benefited from that in contemporary judgments. It's hard to dislike Ronald Reagan, even if you dislike his policies.
Goodbye. God bless you. And God bless the United States of America.
Doug Limerick, ABC News.
I'm Gil Gross in Los Angeles, ABC News, and this is our live and continuing coverage. President Ronald Wilson Reagan has died at the age of 93 after battling Alzheimer's disease for 10 years. Apparently, his condition worsened in the last week. Finally, pneumonia weakened him to the point where he died today at the Reagan home in Bel Air, which is an exclusive part of Los Angeles. The president was really, as Bill Greenwood was talking about with the chopping wood and all, was really a remarkable physical specimen. Think about it. He is not only at 93 did he live longer than any president of the United States ever did, but he survived a gunshot wound near his heart that we found out years later was far more serious than his jokes at the time would have had us believe. Colon cancer, surgery for prostate and skin cancer. 3 years ago, he broke his hip in a fall at home. For people 90 years old, a broken hip often leads to a series of setbacks that results in their death. He came back from that as well. So he really was physically a remarkable man. He also said, I remember, and we talked about his life starting out going from college into a life as a sportscaster, first at WOC in Davenport and then to WHO in Des Moines before heading to Hollywood to become an actor. And we were talking about how late he came to politics. At one point he said, when I was announcing sports, I was happy. And I thought that's all I wanted out of life. And then came the chance at Hollywood, and that was even better. And looking back on it, and this was at the point when he was president, he said, now I'm doing something that makes everything else I've done seem dull as dishwater. And indeed, when, again, you think about that journey, it was some life. As to who he was, what you saw was pretty much what you got. He was exactly who he seemed to be. There is a story, and I can tell this, even though it's a little bit of a laugh, because he used to tell it. It was one of his favorite stories about Hollywood. He often called himself the Errol Flynn of the B movies. And he and Errol Flynn were good friends, had very different lifestyles. And they made a movie together in Santa Fe Trail.
This is live continuous coverage on the death of President Ronald Reagan from ABC News on News Radio WTAM 1100.
Raised in the dust, so that they had a relationship. They made another movie in 1942, and this will tell you something about the president's lifestyle and who he was. It was called Desperate Journey. And Flynn wanted the weekend off. So what he did was he got everybody drunk. He essentially plied everybody with bourbon. And for the people who didn't drink bourbon, such as Ronald Reagan, he emptied whatever was in their cup and put bourbon in. And everybody was drunker than a skunk. But Reagan emptied his paper cup into a spittoon when nobody was looking, and he was the only one who was sober when it was time to shoot. And as President Reagan would tell the story, he said it was time for them to do their lines, and the very first line with Reagan's, and he spoke it without hesitation, obviously sober. The second line was Flynn's, and Flynn wavered uncertainly for a moment and then glared at Reagan and just went, "Oh, why don't you?" And I can't finish that sentence. He was the only man who was sober, and his reputation in Hollywood was as a man who could rise to the great occasion as an actor, occasionally, as in films like Brothers Rat and King's Row, but mainly was a guy who showed up every day, knew all of his lines, hit all of his marks, and was reliable. His presidency and his entry into politics was interesting. As we talk with more guests, we'll get into this in more detail. But essentially, he was a liberal. He worked for the election of Harry Truman. He was a union boss. He referred to him later as a hemophiliac liberal, meaning a bleeding heart liberal. As his career in Hollywood started to wane, he moved into television. There was one point, a low point, that he talked about very little because it hurt, where he was actually doing something he was ill-suited for between movies and television, and that was a Las Vegas act. And he felt alone, and he felt that his friends who had been on the left in Hollywood had really let him down. And it was when he was picked up by General Electric as a spokesman that he really started to change his political philosophy and head toward his eventual career in politics. Now, ABC News' Ann Compton is with us at the White House. Ann?
Well, good evening. The White House has been braced for this for some time. I think, Gil, the clear giveaway was a couple of weeks ago when Nancy Reagan, who has been so protective of her husband, told a large charity audience that the president had now moved to a distant place where even she could not reach him, and how devastating that was to her. What is triggered now is an elaborate ballet of honors and a kind of tribute to a man who, as you've been talking about in his presidency, had really changed so much of the face of America, and both official Washington and the world will want to salute him in a way. I can't tell you, I've got a 15-page elaborate summary of all of this that has been plotted so long in advance, because it's been 10 years since the president told the country that he was riding into the sunset of his years.
Yeah, and apparently initially we will have the body always lies in state in the home state for the first day, and we believe that will be at the Reagan Library in Simi Valley, California.
The initial moments will be spent at a funeral parlor chosen by the family some time ago, and then the Presbyterian Church near his home in Bel Air is where he will remain for 24 hours. I've got to tell you, his affection for and his devotion to California was inevitable, even though, as you've talked about in his background, born in Illinois, educated there, started on radio in Iowa, a very Midwestern, basic kind of guy. California was really his adopted home, and it's my understanding that he will be flown here to Washington for the formal national tribute on board Air Force One. Interesting, these are the 747s that he ordered as president, but they were not finished in time. He was supposed to be able to ride that first one from Washington to California at the end of his 2 terms, the end of his 8 years here in Washington. And the plane wasn't ready in time. The plane has been especially equipped with a hydraulic lift by which a casket can be brought on board, something they found was sadly lacking in the last Air Force One when at the time that John Kennedy was killed. So it looks like President Reagan will get a ride on this 747 Boeing plane that we all know as Air Force One. Right now, both versions of the plane are in Europe with President Bush.
ABC's Ann Compton at the White House, and Ann, we'll get back to you in a bit. Jim Kuhn, who served with President Reagan in his second term, a former personal aide to President Reagan, is live with us now. It's good to talk to you, although the circumstances, of course, are not good. Tell us about President Reagan.
Well, I can tell you this. First off, I'd like to just offer my prayers to Mrs. Reagan and the family. But this man was proud every day that he was in the Oval Office or anywhere as President of the United States. He knew it was a distinct privilege to serve in that capacity, and it was just amazing. He was totally unaffected by the power of the presidency. He took the job very seriously, but as president, he never took himself that way, totally unassuming, self-effacing with his leadership style, and was the same man that walked out of the White House that walked in 8 years earlier. Other than an unbelievable knowledge base and a list of accomplishments that he was able to achieve, he was still personally the same individual 8 years later, which is unbelievable in my
He was
mind.
an interesting combination, Jim, because on the one hand, he was very much the same, people would say regular guy as when he walked in, and always there with, of course, the inevitable job of jar of jelly beans and all, and yet great respect for the office. It would be a rare moment that he'd be in the Oval Office in anything but suit and tie.
Almost always in suit and tie, and whenever he was in suit and tie, that coat always stayed on. The only time he was in casual clothes as if we were there on a weekend, that we weren't at Camp David and he was doing the radio address. But he had immense respect for the office of the presidency and always knew and always said that when you serve as president, you have temporary custody of that office, and he never lost sight of that. But aside from that, here was a man that treated everybody equally. It could have been a foreign leader, a head of state, a head of government, a member of Congress, a Girl Scout or a Boy Scout, an athlete, a Make-A-Wish child. Everybody in his mind was equal, and it was just amazing how he could treat everybody that way, genuinely meaning it, tackling domestic policy and foreign policy at the same time, dealing with crises as any president has to do, and be able to stay on such an even keel. And I have to tell you, serving very closely with him in the last 4 years, as staff, it was very hard to control our emotions, because in good times and in bad times, you're up and down, on and off the Richter scale. Mm-hmm. And Ronald Reagan was always able to stay on an even keel. It was just amazing how he did that. And one other thing I'd like to add is he had two unique qualities that are hard for anybody that goes into public office. He was very electable because of his personal appeal, but yet at the same time, he was able to effectively govern because he had a concrete domestic and foreign policy agenda, and he never lost sight of that.
And we will be talking about both those things more and more as the day goes on.
This is live continuous coverage on the death of President Ronald Reagan from ABC News on News Radio WTAM 1100.
At the age of 93. I'm Gil Gross in Los Angeles. This is live continuous coverage from ABC News.
The flag at the White House has been lowered to half-staff in honor of the death of former President Ronald Reagan. Mr. Reagan was surrounded by family members when he died at his home in Bel Air, California today. ABC's Bill Greenwood is live in Washington with more. Bill?
Karen, the former president was 93 years of age and has suffered from Alzheimer's for some 10 years. But sources say his condition had deteriorated significantly during the past week. Then last night he took a dangerous turn for the worse because of pneumonia, and he passed away just a few hours ago at his home in the Bel Air section of Los Angeles. As you said, the president's family was with him at the time. Mr. Reagan was America's 40th president, the first in 30 years to serve 2 terms. I'm Bill Greenwood, live in Washington.
Mr. Reagan, who devoted his presidency to winning the Cold War, scaling back big government, and making people believe it was morning again in America, has died at his home in California. I'm Karen Chase, ABC News.